Service dog blocked a pregnant woman from entering the plane. What they found inside her sent them running. The international terminal pulsed with noise. Overhead announcements echoed through the vaulted ceilings, while passengers shuffled through security queues, clutching passports and boarding passes. Rolling suitcases clicked rhythmically against the tile floors. It was peak travel hour at the city's busiest airport, and tensions buzzed beneath the surface. Mark Fleshowell saying under his breath. A seasoned airport security officer stood near gate B12 with a focused gaze. Years on the job had sharpened his instincts, but it was not his experience alone that made him reliable. At his side, tethered by a short lead and sitting alert, was Havoc, a highly trained German shepherd, assigned to the K9 Explosives Detection Unit. Havoc's ears twitched. His nose flared as the crowd shifted toward the boarding gate. Mark noticed his partner tense, tail stiffening, muscles coiling as though primed to spring. Then, without warning, Havoc let out a sharp, urgent bark. Mark's posture straightened instantly. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. Havoc suddenly lunged forward, barking with increasing ferocity. Passengers jolted in alarm. Startled gasps rippled through the line. The dog was now locked on one individual, a woman approaching the boarding ramp. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed in loose, comfortable clothes, one hand protectively cradling her visibly pregnant belly. "Please, someone, please control that dog," the woman cried out, panic rising in her voice. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Havoc would not stop. He growled low in his throat, his body rigid, eyes fixed on the woman. Mark planted his boots firmly and gave a command. "Havoc, heel!" The dog did not obey. Passengers had now stopped moving. A few pulled out their phones to record the scene. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The woman took a slow step backward, her face pale, tears brimming. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Mark exchanged a glance with another officer nearby. They had seen Havoc react to threats before. Drugs, weapons, hidden devices, but never with this level of intensity. His behavior was precise, insistent, not confused or agitated. He was trying to say something. "Ma'am," Mark said carefully, stepping forward. "We need you to come with us for a secondary screening. This is standard protocol." I am 6 months pregnant," she said, trembling. "Why are you doing this to me?" "This is for your safety and everyone else's," he replied firmly. As he spoke, Havoc lunged again, barking, and his front paws briefly landed on the woman's hip. She gasped, staggering slightly as a gasp broke through the crowd. "Now!" Mark barked at the surrounding team. 2 officers swiftly moved in, taking gentle but firm hold of the woman's arms. "No, please! What is happening?" she pleaded as they guided her away from the gate. Havoc continued to growl as he was restrained, still straining against the leash, his gaze never once shifting from the woman's form. Mark's heart pounded. He had trusted Havoc with his life before. Whatever this was, it was more than nerves or fear. Havoc had sensed something, and Mark intended to find out exactly what. The private screening room was cool, sterile, and tightly secured. Bright overhead lights cast a harsh glow on the smooth tile floor. The pregnant woman sat trembling in a metal chair near the corner, her eyes red from crying, arms wrapped protectively around her belly. Her carry-on suitcase and handbag had been placed on the inspection table. 2 security officers and a female screener moved carefully, following standard procedure. One scanned her passport, another ran her belongings through a second X-ray machine, and the third prepared for a full-body scan. Mark stood just inside the doorway, watching the process unfold. He had not taken his eyes off the woman, or off Havoc, who remained just beyond the room's glass panel. The German shepherd's behavior was escalating. He paced in tight circles, growling intermittently, occasionally leaping up to scratch furiously at the door with both front paws. "Still nothing," one of the screeners muttered, reviewing the scan results. "No contraband, nothing hidden in the lining, no medical devices, no flagged materials." Another officer examined the suitcase and bag manually, checking for false bottoms or tampered zippers. Everything looks normal. She's clean. Inside the room, the woman shook her head slowly, tears rolling down her cheeks. I don't know why I'm here, she whispered. I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to go home. Please, I'm pregnant. I would never put my baby at risk. Mark stepped closer. Ma'am, we're just being thorough. I know this is frightening. Let's take a breath. Can I ask a few questions? She nodded shakily. Have you had any recent complications with your pregnancy? Pain? Shortness of breath? Anything out of the ordinary? No, she said hoarsely. Everything's been fine. I had my last checkup just last week. No issues. But as she finished speaking, her eyes widened and her entire body tensed. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. She bent forward in the chair, clutching her belly with both arms. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. Something's wrong, she whispered, her voice filled with fear. I don't know what's happening. It hurts. Something's wrong. Get medical now, Mark barked, already reaching for his radio. Within moments, 2 paramedics rushed in through the secure hallway, wheeling a medical kit. They crouched beside her, checking her vitals as she trembled with pain. Her pulse is unstable, one of them said urgently. Could be premature labor, or an internal issue. While the officers focused on her condition, Habak's behavior intensified. He began howling, a long, rising sound that echoed down the corridor. Then he lunged at the door again, paws pounding, nose pressed against the glass. Mark turned toward the commotion. What is it, boy? He muttered under his breath, moving quickly into the hallway. The moment he opened the door, Habak darted inside and went straight to the woman's small carry-on suitcase, which had been cleared minutes earlier. He growled deep in his throat, then began to sniff aggressively, circling the luggage like prey. Hold him back, one officer shouted, but Mark raised a hand. No, let him work. Habak's nose pressed into the seam near the bottom of the suitcase. Suddenly, he sat and let out a single forceful bark, his signal for danger. Just then, Special Operations Security Officer Carter entered the room, having been alerted about the medical emergency. He stopped short as he saw Habak's stance. His eyes narrowed. We need to open that suitcase, he said grimly. Now. Everyone froze. The pregnant woman groaned from the chair, sweat on her brow, pain etched across her face. Mark felt his pulse quicken. Habak had been relentless for a reason, and they were about to find out what it was. The atmosphere inside the screening room had shifted from tense to electric. Special Operations Security Officer Carter knelt beside the carry-on suitcase, his gloved fingers slowly unclipping the final latch. Mark stood behind him, Habak pressed tightly to his side, the dog's body low, muscles taut. The other officers took a cautious step back. Even the paramedics had paused their efforts to stabilize the woman, now unconscious and being prepped for emergency evacuation. As the suitcase opened, Carter gently folded back a layer of clothes, soft maternity wear, toiletries, a pair of flat shoes. But beneath that, something unexpected caught his eye. A tightly folded blanket sat awkwardly pressed to one side of the case, far bulkier than the rest of the contents suggested. He exchanged a look with Mark, then slowly peeled it away. Underneath the fabric was a small metallic device. It was no larger than a deck of cards. Sleek, cold, and clearly not meant to be seen. Its surface was smooth, with a tiny embedded circuit panel and 2 faint blinking red indicators. A strange chemical scent clung to the air around it, one Habak had picked up long before human senses could. Mark leaned in, voice low and urgent. That's no personal electronics. Carter's jaw tensed. Call the bomb response unit, right now. Mark was already reaching for his radio. Control. This is Fletcher, Level 3 emergency. I repeat, Level 3. Possible explosive component found in Gate B12 screening room. Initiate lockdown protocol. Immediate response requested. Outside, alarms triggered in sequence. Automated doors began to seal. Uniformed officers sprinted through the terminal as overhead speakers ordered passengers to evacuate calmly. Panic had not set in yet, but it was coming. Back inside, Havoc lowered his head, sniffed again, then let out a rapid series of short, forceful barks, each one echoing against the sterile walls. His fur bristled along his spine. "He's confirming it's a threat," Mark said. "That is his alert sequence." The woman, still unconscious, was lifted onto a stretcher by the medics. One checked her pulse. "She's stable, but barely. We need to move her now." "She goes straight to isolation," Carter ordered. "No contact with outside parties until we know who handed her that suitcase." Moments later, the bomb response unit arrived, 3 officers in full protective gear. They entered the room with precise, deliberate movements, one of them gently taking the device from its hidden compartment and placing it into a containment unit. A handheld scanner beeped steadily as they examined the mechanism. "What are we looking at?" Carter asked. The lead technician glanced up. "It is not a bomb, not in the traditional sense, but this is a trigger, likely a short-range transmitter. Remote activation, possibly designed to set off something else." "On the plane," Mark said, finishing the thought aloud. His blood ran cold. As the medics wheeled the woman out, airport tech support pulled up the security camera footage from earlier that morning. Dozens of fast-forwarded clips played simultaneously across the screen. Then one feed caught Carter's eye. Rewind that section. At 9:41 a.m., the pregnant woman, clearly limping slightly, approached the check-in counter. As she struggled with her bags, a man in a gray hoodie and baseball cap stepped forward to assist. He smiled, handed her the suitcase, then slipped away into the crowd. "Zoom in. Do we have facial recognition on him?" Carter asked. Mark stepped forward. "I saw that man yesterday in the outer security perimeter. He was loitering near the international departures gate." "We just found your courier," Carter muttered, handed it on her, used her condition as a disguise to smuggle it through. "She had no idea, or she was told it was something else," Mark added. "She looked terrified, and when the pain hit her, I think she was genuinely panicking." The bomb response technician returned. "There is no active explosive component in the suitcase, but this device could absolutely be used to trigger another unit. Then we have to assume the real device is already on board," Carter said grimly. This was just the signal switch. Mark turned toward the main concourse. Over the intercom, the airport's emergency voice system came online. "Attention all passengers and personnel. Gate B12 is now under immediate lockdown. Please evacuate all terminals in proximity. Follow security instructions and remain calm." Outside the glass walls of the screening room, people began rushing away from the gate. Children clutched parents' hands. Flight attendants called into radios, and airport police quickly surrounded the affected area. Carter looked to Mark. "Full sweep. I want dogs, bomb techs, robotics. Every bag, every panel, every overhead bin gets checked." Mark nodded. "Havoc's already on it." Caltrail 3 had begun, a potential bomb aboard a commercial airliner. One trigger found, another still hidden, hundreds of lives at risk. And a German shepherd named Havoc had just saved them from walking straight into disaster. Inside the evacuated terminal, tension buzzed like static in the air. Special security units worked quickly, their boots echoing on the polished tile floor as bomb detection canines were brought in to assist. Havoc remained at the front of the operation, his handler Mark never leaving his side. Despite the chaos, the German shepherd's focus was unshakable. "Keep the perimeter locked," Mark instructed through his comms, as he and Havoc moved swiftly through the jet bridge toward the aircraft. "Havoc's leading. Everyone fall in behind." The aircraft remained grounded on the tarmac, surrounded by emergency lights and tactical vehicles. Passengers had been evacuated, baggage handlers cleared out, and every crew member accounted for. Still, something unseen lurked, something that could bring the entire plane down. Havoc stepped into the fuselage, nose twitching, tail stiff. He walked with sharp intent down the aisle, past rows of empty seats, ignoring the overhead compartments. At the rear of the aircraft, he stopped at the crew hatch leading to the cargo hold. Then, with a sudden growl, he barked once, loud and clear. "He's got something," Mark said urgently. "Open the hatch." 2 technicians unsealed the hatch. Mark and Havoc descended into the cargo bay, followed closely by Carter and 2 bomb techs in full gear. The space was dim, cluttered with checked luggage stacked neatly in metal bins. But Havoc had zeroed in on one specific crate, wedged near the rear bulkhead. He circled it, nose brushing along its edges, then barked again and pressed a paw firmly against it. Carter moved forward and carefully opened the crate. Inside, tucked beneath a false bottom, lay an innocuous black device, no larger than a portable recorder. At first glance, it resembled nothing more than outdated audio equipment. But the wiry components beneath its outer shell told a different story. "This is it," said one of the bomb techs. Remote ignition module embedded into a faux casing. If the signal had gone through, this thing would have gone live. Mark's pulse pounded, and if Havoc had not stopped her, it would have. The device was quickly contained and removed. Once it was secured, technicians began scanning for any further threats. But it was clear now, this had not been a suicide mission. It had been a meticulously planned test, a probe against airport defenses. Later, at the hospital, the woman who had unknowingly carried the decoy trigger regained consciousness. A nurse and 2 officers stood nearby as she blinked through the fluorescent lights overhead, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Where am I?" she asked weakly. "You are safe," said the nurse gently. "You were brought here from the airport. There was a medical emergency, but you and your baby are both stable." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "The dog, the one who barked at me. I remember now." "Yes," the officer said. "He may have saved your life and the lives of hundreds more." The woman broke into tears. "I did not know. I swear, I thought the man was helping me. He said he worked for the airline. He gave me the suitcase because I was struggling with mine. I just wanted to go see my husband. I am just a mother. I would never—" "We believe you," the officer said firmly. "You were used, but we are tracking the man who gave you the bag." Back at the airport, the investigation intensified. Forensics had lifted a partial print from the decoy trigger. Surveillance had already captured multiple angles of the suspect handing off the suitcase. 3 hours later, he was caught attempting to leave the city via a rideshare vehicle. Authorities intercepted him at a highway checkpoint. The man, traveling under an alias, was quickly identified. Karim Yusuf, a known international courier with ties to smuggling organizations. He had operated under various identities across Europe and Asia, specializing in transporting sensitive components for criminal and terrorist networks. When confronted with the evidence, video footage, fingerprints, and customs records, Yusuf refused to speak, but his silence was telling. As he was led away in handcuffs, Carter turned to Mark and said, "We were not just lucky. Havoc was right from the beginning." Mark looked down at the German shepherd, who now sat quietly, eyes alert, still tracking every movement around them. "No," Mark replied. "He was never guessing. He knew." And in that moment they all understood. This had not just been a mission stopped. It had been a disaster prevented, and it was all thanks to a service dog named Havoc. The following day, headlines across the country featured the same image, a powerful shot captured by a stunned passenger in the middle of the chaos. In the photo, Havoc stood poised next to the burst-open suitcase in the center of an empty airport concourse. The light above cast a quiet glow over the scene, his eyes alert, his posture firm. Below the photo ran a bold caption, "One dog, hundreds of lives." At the airport's press conference, security officials, aviation authorities, and media outlets gathered as the director of airport safety stepped forward to address the cameras. "We owe a debt today," he began, voice steady, not only to the quick response of our officers, but to one German shepherd whose instincts stopped a potential disaster in its tracks. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the black and tan dog seated beside Mark, his handler. Havoc, a trained service dog, did not just detect something suspicious. He prevented what could have been one of the most tragic events in our airport's history. Mark stood next to Havoc, holding back a swell of emotion as a medal engraved with the airport's seal was gently lowered around the dog's neck. He was trained to detect danger, Mark said, voice tight with pride. But what he did yesterday was protect life. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, echoing off the terminal walls. Somewhere in the crowd, a quiet moment unfolded as a nurse held a newborn child in her arms, standing next to the woman Havoc had protected. She wore a hospital bracelet, her eyes brimming with tears. "If not for him," she whispered to a nearby reporter, "I would have never known what was coming. He did not just save me, he saved my baby." Days later, after the noise and attention faded, Havoc lay on the porch outside Mark's quiet home. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and gold. The soft evening breeze rustled the trees, and Havoc's eyes slowly blinked with the ease of peace. Around his neck hung the medal, and just beneath it a small engraved tag that read, "To a Havoc, our guardian in silence." And in that silence he rested, not just as a dog, but as a hero who had kept the world safe, one breath at a time. If this story of Havoc, the silent hero who trusted his instincts, stood his ground, and saved lives, moved your heart, then you are in the right place. At Amazing Paws Stories, we bring you real-life tales of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their four-legged guardians. From airport runways to living room couches, these animals do more than we could ever imagine, and sometimes they change everything. Do not miss the next incredible journey. Subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories. Turn on notifications. Share your thoughts and love in the comments, because every paw has a story, and every story deserves to be told.
A retired officer walked into the shelter just looking for company. But when a grizzled canine in the corner let out a broken, trembling whimper, the man froze. It wasn't just any dog. It was his partner. Lost years ago, thought to be gone forever. What happened next will make you believe that even after war, loss, and time, love never forgets. But before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far loyalty can travel. And if you believe that no hero man or dog should ever be forgotten, hit that subscribe button, because this story may just change how you see courage, friendship, and saying goodbye. Savannah, Georgia, late October. Overcast, crisp air, golden leaves scattering under gray skies. The chill of late autumn had settled over Savannah like a quiet sigh, painting the brick-lined streets with amber leaves and brushing the skies with an iron-gray melancholy. A faint drizzle dusted the sidewalks as a retired officer, Thomas Callahan, stepped out of his beat-up Ford Crown Victoria and closed the door with the familiar grunt of aching knees and old memories. He looked up at the sign, Pine Haven Retirement Shelter for Service Animals. It was modest red brick, peeling paint, a little American flag waving wearily in the wind. But it held something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Thomas Callahan, 71, was the kind of man who wore silence like a second skin. Over 6 feet tall but now slightly stooped, with a trim build hardened by decades on the force and softened only slightly by age. His white hair was neatly combed back, and his storm-blue eyes had dulled only in brightness, not in clarity. Life had given him losses, a heart condition, a quiet house haunted by absence, and a late wife whose laughter still echoed in his mind like an old patrol radio. He wasn't here out of loneliness, he told himself. He just needed someone who understood quiet the way he did. Inside, the warmth of the shelter greeted him like an old friend. The front lobby smelled faintly of pine cleaner and dog biscuits, with bulletin boards covered in photos of adopted animals and handwritten thank you notes. A bell chimed as he stepped in. Behind the counter sat Grace Holloway, 29, the assistant care coordinator. She looked up from a folder and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Grace was of average height, thin from forgetting to eat during long shifts, and wore scrubs the color of moss. Her dark brown curls were tied back in a messy bun, and her eyes, hazel, tired, observant, had seen more heartbreak in 5 years here than most saw in a lifetime. Raised in foster care and aged by it, she carried compassion like a duty. Animals never lied, she always said. They didn't leave you for someone better. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, standing with an air of practiced patience. "I heard you have some old-timers needing a home," Thomas replied, his voice gravelly but steady. She smiled a little more genuinely at that. "Well, you're in the right place. Most folks come in looking for puppies. The older ones don't always get a second shot." Thomas gave a slow nod. "Neither do some people." She led him down the hallway past rows of kennels, each with its own small story of abandonment, loyalty, or fate. The hum of ceiling fans mixed with the occasional bark or soft shuffle. The hallway curved slightly, leading to a quieter wing reserved for the oldest and most sensitive dogs. Then came a sound. Faint at first, like wind through dry leaves, but it stopped Thomas in his tracks. A low, broken whimper. His head turned sharply, breath hitching like an old engine trying to start. That sound, he had heard it once before, 7 years ago, in the back of a patrol SUV, during a cold February stakeout, when everything had gone wrong. He walked faster, past pens of dozing retrievers and wheezing beagles, until he stood in front of Kennel 47. There, in the far corner, lay a German shepherd, half curled, half alert. His coat, once rich with black and bronze, was faded and rough in patches. His eyes, though cloudy with age, still flickered with that same familiar glint of focus, loyalty, pain. A long, jagged scar ran from his left hip to the ankle. Thomas knew that scar. He remembered the day it happened, the gunfire, the sprint through an alley, and the body they had pulled from behind a dumpster. Thomas dropped to one knee. "Shadow," he whispered, the name tasting like disbelief. The dog's ears twitched. Slowly, the shepherd pushed himself to his feet, legs trembling from disuse. He staggered forward, sniffed, and then whimpered again. Louder this time, mournful and urgent. His nose touched the cold bars of the kennel, reaching. Thomas reached back. For a moment there was only stillness, thick as fog. Then, with a sound like a breath held too long finally escaping, Shadow pressed his head hard into Thomas's Shakot's hand, letting out a whine that cracked the silence like a fault line. Thomas clenched his eyes shut. His fingers trembled against the matted fur. Grace stood behind them, stunned. "You know him?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I trained him myself. He was my partner for 5 years. We lost track after he was reassigned during the gang unit restructure. They told me he'd gone north. I never knew what happened after that." She stepped closer, blinking. "His file said he was transferred, but the trail stops there. No adoption logs, no transfer records. It's like he just disappeared from the system until he turned up here last month." Shadow let out another low sound, now more insistent, pawing at the bars. Grace, moved by the rawness of the moment, unlocked the gate and stepped aside. Shadow didn't wait. He limped into Thomas's arms, pressing himself fully against the man who had once stood between him and every bullet. Thomas wrapped his arms around the old dog's neck and didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Grace turned away discreetly and wiped at her eyes, silently vowing to check every inch of Shadow's file again. Something about this wasn't right. Dogs don't just vanish from government records, especially not decorated canines. She glanced back at the pair and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Peace. Fragile, but real. Forming in the middle of a storm. She reached for her tablet, heart already stirring with the need to know the full truth behind the dog with the scarred leg and the man who had never stopped looking behind him. The rain had lightened outside, leaving the windows of Pinehaven streaked with glistening trails that caught the amber glow of late afternoon. In the consultation room tucked behind the front lobby, Thomas Callahan sat in a modest faux leather chair, Shadow curled at his feet like a sentinel rediscovered. The shepherd's breath was slow but steady, his muzzle resting gently on the old man's boot as though he never left it. Grace Holloway, clipboard balanced in one hand, sat across from him, legs crossed tightly, eyes flicking between Shadow and Thomas like she couldn't quite believe the image in front of her. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers steepled under his chin. 7 years, he murmured. I thought he was gone. Dead, maybe, but he was just misplaced. Grace glanced at the tablet in her lap. There's no mention of any transfer to civilian ownership or even long-term fostering. He appeared in our intake system 6 weeks ago, labeled retired without handler contact. It doesn't make sense. Thomas let out a breath that sounded more like a growl. It never did. He looked down at Shadow. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and his eyes lifted cloudy but sharp enough to catch the emotion behind them. We were partners for 5 years in the field. I got him as a pup from Fort Stewart's K-9 unit. He was too aggressive for general patrol, but with me, Thomas gave a sad smile. He learned to listen, to wait, to think before biting. Grace tilted her head, curious. What kind of work did you two do together? Thomas hesitated, then ran a hand through his white hair. Human trafficking detail. Joint task force. We were deep in a case against a cartel ring out of Atlanta smuggling young girls through warehouses in Savannah. She blinked, the clipboard suddenly forgotten in her lap. We'd been on surveillance for 2 weeks. We finally got the green light to move in. There was a firefight, he said, voice growing tight. A grenade rolled under the squad car. I didn't see it in time. His gaze drifted, but his hand reached instinctively to his chest. Shadow did, he continued. He shoved me back, took most of the blast in his hind leg. I dragged him out of there myself. When the dust settled, they said he was too injured to return to duty. Liability, they called it. And because of the way the operation went down, some bureaucratic nightmare, they reassigned him to a government impound until they could decide what to do with him. Grace's eyes softened. And they never called you? I called every week for months, he said bitterly. Got stonewalled. And after a while you stop calling because it hurts more than the silence. He paused, leaning down to scratch gently behind Shadow's ear. The shepherd wagged his tail weakly. I thought he was put down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the door opened softly, and in stepped a woman in her late 40s, wearing dark green scrubs and a gentle frown. Dr. Nia Adler, Grace said, standing. Our vet on site. Dr. Adler had the brisk, no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with animals who couldn't afford vague diagnostics. She was tall, wiry, with olive-toned skin and sharp gray eyes behind round glasses. Her curly salt-and-pepper hair was tied into a braid slung over her shoulder, and she carried a small tablet under one arm. I heard we had a canine reunion, she said dryly. Then her gaze landed on Shadow. Her voice softened. Good Lord, is that Shadow? I didn't know the name, but I know this dog. She knelt beside him with a practiced hand and began palpating gently along his spine and hips. Shadow allowed the contact, but winced slightly when she pressed his back left leg. Chronic joint stiffness, she murmured. Osteoarthritis. Advanced, but not irreversible. Thomas looked up, jaw tight. How bad? Dr. Adler sat back on her heels and sighed. He's in pain, but he's stoic. Dogs like this, military trained, they won't vocalize until they're past their limit. He needs a low-stress environment. Soft surfaces, anti-inflammatories, possibly hydrotherapy. Without it, the stiffness will become debilitating. Grace's brow furrowed. So, no stairs, no long runs. No loud environments. And definitely no kennels like the ones here, the vet added with a glance at Thomas. His stress levels spiked every time we walked him past the younger dogs. He's been on edge since the moment he arrived until today. Thomas glanced down. Shadow was breathing peacefully, tail twitching gently in some quiet dream. "I can take him," he said simply. "I don't care how much it costs. I'll mortgage what's left of my pension if I have to." Grace tapped her tablet. "Actually, I might have found something." She turned the screen toward them. "It looks like there was an error in Shadow's transfer paperwork. His record was misfiled under a non-K9 civilian adoption registry. That's why no one matched him with you." Thomas blinked. "You're telling me someone just checked the wrong box?" Grace gave a wry smile. "A very expensive 7-year-long box, apparently." Dr. Adler shook her head. "Unreal, and not uncommon, especially with the older systems." Thomas leaned back in his chair, emotions swirling between relief and fury. Grace leaned forward. "Let me make a few calls. I know a grant program that helps veterans adopt retired service animals. If the paperwork can be corrected, we may be able to have him transferred into your care fully no cost." Thomas looked stunned. "Why would they do that?" Grace gave a quiet shrug. "Because sometimes the system breaks things, but people can fix them." He swallowed hard. "Thank you." Shadow stirred again, raising his head and bumping it gently against Thomas's leg as if to say, "We're still a team." It was nearly dusk when Thomas Callahan pulled into the gravel driveway of his small home just outside Savannah. The porch light flickered on with a tired buzz, casting long shadows over the creaky swing and wind chime made from old shell casings. The house was modest one-story, pale blue paint faded from years of Georgia sun, with a brick chimney that hadn't seen fire since Margaret passed 5 winters ago. Thomas killed the engine and sat in the silence for a moment. Shadow's empty leash curled beside him on the passenger seat. He hadn't brought the dog home yet, not until the shelter approved the transfer, not until the paperwork proved what his heart already knew. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and something long unspoken. Thomas moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had once been fast but now had time. The living room held an old recliner, a fireplace lined with black and white photos, and a side table cluttered with books about law enforcement, American history, and one worn copy of Where the Red Fern Grows. He headed straight for the back bedroom, what had once been Margaret's reading room, now converted into storage, and dropped to his knees in front of an old army footlocker. Its metal clasps creaked open like bones settling, and inside were pieces of his past. Medals, badges, old reports, a folded flag, and somewhere, if memory served him right, a leather-bound notebook. He found it near the bottom. Scuffed, cracked at the spine, smelling faintly of coffee and gunpowder, the notebook was his K9 unit field journal. He flipped through pages filled with scribbled commands, training schedules, behavior notes, and then paused, his breath catching. There it was, a page near the center, in blue ink faded by time. Shadow, K9 Partner, Unit 47, deployed January 11th, recertified April 3rd. Handled by Officer Thomas Callahan. Beneath the notes was a rough sketch Margaret had drawn one night when she'd been waiting at the kitchen table during a late shift. A dog's head in profile noble, ears perked, eyes alert. She'd written beneath it, "He watches over you even when I can't." Thomas closed the notebook and held it to his chest. His ribs ached, not from effort, but from memory. He sat back against the closet wall and stayed there until night swallowed the room. At Pine Haven, Shadow wasn't taking the separation well. The dog lay curled in the back corner of his kennel, facing the wall, eyes dull, food untouched. He hadn't moved much since Thomas left. Grace Holloway sat cross-legged just outside the kennel door, a bowl of warm chicken broth in hand. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and there were dark crescents beneath her eyes, evidence of yet another skipped dinner and another night staying past shift. Grace had tried everything, coaxing, soft words, even music. But Shadow remained still, as if the light inside him had dimmed with Thomas's departure. He wasn't sick, he was mourning. A soft knock on the wall behind her made her turn. Liam Baxter, the night volunteer, stood there holding a small box. In his mid-30s, Liam had short blonde hair, arms tattooed with dog tags and paw prints, and an easygoing demeanor that disguised a quiet sadness. A former EMT, he'd left the job after a tragic accident involving a child and a car crash. Since then, he'd found peace in caring for animals no one else had time for. "I got the towel," he said softly, from Callahan's car, passenger seat. Grace took it and thanked him. The towel was old olive green, frayed along the edges, but unmistakably soaked in Thomas's scent. She moved slowly, speaking only in a whisper. "Hey, buddy, got something for you." She reached through the bars and laid the towel just inside. Shadow didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his nose twitched. A low, questioning whimper escaped his throat as he turned slightly, sniffing the fabric. Within minutes, he was lying with his head on it. Grace sat back, blinking hard. "He thinks he's been left again." Liam leaned against the wall. "They remember better than we do." The next morning, Thomas returned with the notebook in hand, every step heavy with the weight of hope. He handed it directly to Grace in the admin office. She flipped through it slowly, eyes widening as she reached the page with the signature. "This is perfect," she said. "We'll submit this to the Department of Canine Affairs and attach a witness verification. That'll be enough to fast-track the transfer." Thomas nodded, jaw clenched. "Good, I'll wait." He didn't have to wait long. That evening, while the sun dipped behind the pine trees out back, Grace approached his truck with a clipboard, a hopeful smile on her face. "Congratulations," she said. "He's officially yours again." The late afternoon sun spilled across the porch as Thomas eased open the back door of his home, the hinges groaning in protest. He stepped aside, giving Shadow space to cross the threshold first. The old German shepherd hesitated only a moment, then stepped forward, nostrils flaring. His paws made soft clicks against the hardwood floor as he moved through the hallway like a ghost returning to familiar ruins. Shadow's coat had grown dull with age, and his gait was slower than Thomas remembered, a shuffle rather than a stride. Yet, as he wandered room to room, something began to flicker in his eyes, recognition, remembrance. He paused at the archway into the living room, ears lifting slightly, tail swaying. Thomas followed, stopping just behind him. "Go ahead," he said, voice quiet. With a soft whine, Shadow moved to the old armchair in the corner, the one beside the window where Thomas had once spent long hours cleaning his service revolver and reading the paper while Shadow dozed at his feet. The chair was worn now, its arms rubbed bare from time and habit, a plaid blanket still draped across the back. Shadow pressed his nose into the cushion and let out a low huff. Then he climbed up, not gracefully, but with determination, and curled into a tight circle atop the seat, tail tucked under chin, eyes half-lidded. Thomas smiled faintly. "Still your spot, huh?" The house hadn't changed much. Margaret's touches lingered in every room, the embroidered curtains, the family photos on the mantel, the cinnamon-scented candles in the kitchen, dusty but still whole. She'd been gone nearly 5 years, taken by cancer with more grace than Thomas had thought possible. He still heard her voice sometimes in the quiet, especially on days like this. He walked over to the side table and opened the bottom drawer, retrieving a small black audio recorder. The plastic was scratched, but the play button still worked. He pressed it, and after a click of static her voice came through. Laughter bright, easy, filled with mischief. "Oh, Tom, if you're listening to this, you're probably hiding in your armchair again, pretending the world's too loud. Well, tough. You promised to be brave. You promised to keep loving, even when I'm gone." Shadow stirred. His head lifted, ears twitching. The moment Margaret's voice played again, "Give that handsome pup of yours a kiss from me." Shadow chuffed, leaped awkwardly from the chair, and padded over to the side table. He sniffed at the recorder, then licked the speaker gently, tail wagging. Thomas sat down on the floor, one hand resting on Shadow's back. "She never forgot you either," he said softly. The following morning, Thomas stood in the backyard, hands on hips, assessing the weathered structure that had once been Shadow's outdoor shelter. It was more shed than kennel a slanted-roof, timber-built den nestled beneath the branches of a crooked pecan tree. Its roof sagged, and ivy had crept across one side like a slow invasion. "Lord," he muttered, "you'd be better off in a cardboard box." "Still standing, though," came a voice from behind. Thomas turned to see Elmer Cobb, his next-door neighbor of 22 years, stepping through the gate with a rusted toolbox in hand. Elmer was 80, but built like he'd made peace with gravity long ago. Stooped shoulders, long arms, and a gait like a shuffle through syrup. He wore faded overalls, a camouflage cap, and a pair of wraparound sunglasses that made him look like a raccoon with attitude. "Figured I'd come help before you hurt your back." Elmer gestured toward the structure. "That thing looks like it lost a war." Thomas smirked. "Kinda like us." They got to work in the quiet way old men do. No music, few words, just the rhythm of hammers and saws and shared history. Shadow lay on a patch of sun nearby, head resting on his paws, ears perked at every nail strike. "So," Elmer said eventually, handing Thomas a screw, "that the dog?" Thomas nodded. "He remembers the place?" "Every corner," Thomas said, "but it's bittersweet." Elmer nodded, then adjusted a support beam. "Place never sounded the same after Margaret passed. This dog's a good sound." By late afternoon, the kennel stood reborn roof patched, floor reinforced, a clean woolen mat spread across the interior. Thomas placed Shadow's old chewbone near the entrance, though he doubted the dog would care for toys anymore. Still, the gesture felt necessary. That night, Thomas sat in his armchair, newspaper open but unread. Shadow lay at his feet, sighing every so often in contentment. Thomas reached down and ran a hand through the thick ruff of fur along Shadow's neck. "You remember it all, don't you?" he said. "All the days we patrolled together, all the nights we waited on bad men to make bad moves, and now here we are. Two old souls waiting again for peace, or time, or whatever's left." The house was quiet save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the pecan tree rustled softly in the breeze, and from the rebuilt kennel the faint creak of settling wood echoed like a memory settling into place. The night air in Savannah was unusually crisp for late autumn, the kind that crept into the bones and made porch boards groan beneath passing feet. Street lamps cast yellow pools of light onto cracked sidewalks, and the neighborhood of Chestnut Bend, usually the kind of place where screen doors creaked but never locked, slept in an illusion of safety. But not everyone was asleep. Thomas Callahan sat half-dozing in his recliner, the television screen glowing with the low flicker of a nature documentary. His hand rested unconsciously on Shadow's back, rising and falling with the dog's even breath. Outside, the wind rustled through the pecan tree, whispering of something just a little off. At exactly 2:46 a.m., Shadow's head snapped up. His ears twitched, then stiffened. A low growl bubbled in his throat, not the dream growl of old age, but the deliberate, trained warning of a soldier sensing a breach. Thomas blinked awake. "What is it, boy?" Shadow stood, limping slightly, but alert nose raised, body stiff. He padded over to the front door and let out a short, low bark. Thomas rose slower, grabbing the flashlight from the side table and slipping on his jacket. "You smell something?" Shadow barked once again and moved toward the back of the house. Thomas opened the door to a hush of wind and dry leaves skittering across the yard. The street was still, but Shadow bolted down the porch steps, not with youthful speed, but with purposeful direction. His nose stayed low, tracing something Thomas couldn't see, but knew was there. "All right, I'm with you," Thomas said, following his old partner down the sidewalk barefoot in rubber slippers. They passed the Cobb residence, where Elmer's porch light was still burned out. Shadow sniffed once, then turned down the next block toward a smaller, older house with hydrangeas in the yard and an American flag faded to pink by the sun. It was Mrs. Henley's house. Margaret Henley was a retired school librarian, widowed, late 70s, with a back curved like a question mark and a wardrobe of knitted cardigans. She wore thick glasses and always carried peppermint in her pockets. Most days, she could be found talking to her rose bushes or feeding the blue jays. She and Thomas had exchanged casseroles and quiet nods for years. Tonight, however, her house was dark. Too dark. The porch light, usually automatic, was off. Shadow growled again, low and sharp. He veered to the side of the house, and that's when Thomas saw it, the back door ajar. His heart stuttered. He reached for his phone, whispering, "Stay," to Shadow before dialing the non-emergency line. But Shadow didn't stay. With surprising swiftness, the shepherd pushed through the cracked door and disappeared into the shadows inside. "Damn it," Thomas muttered and followed. Inside, the house was silent but tense, like something waiting to snap. The hallway smelled of linoleum and old perfume. Thomas could just make out Shadow's silhouette moving ahead, hugging the walls. Then, a creak floorboard, wait. Shadow barked once, deep and furious, and Thomas burst into the kitchen to see a man in a black hoodie frozen halfway through climbing out the window. A silver toaster stuffed into his backpack clattered to the ground. The man turned, startled, and lunged toward the hallway, but Shadow leapt. Not high, but enough. He sank his teeth into the man's pant leg and held, growling with primal force. The man screamed, lost his footing, and collapsed face first onto the linoleum just as Thomas flipped on the light and aimed his flashlight beam into the intruder's eyes. "Savannah PD's got your number, son," Thomas grunted, "and this here is your second mistake." It took 3 minutes for the police to arrive. Officer Reynaldo Torres, a 33-year-old with a muscular build and a perpetually skeptical brow, was first on the scene. He wore his badge like a question and held his flashlight like it was a second chance. He was known for being a good cop, if a little slow to trust retirees. "What the hell happened here?" Reynaldo asked, helping Thomas steady Shadow, who was panting now but still alert. "Caught your boy mid-burglary," Thomas said. "Dog tracked him here from 3 houses down." Reynaldo raised an eyebrow. "Tracked? That dog?" Thomas smiled. "K9 unit. Retired, not expired." Mrs. Henley, woken by the commotion, shuffled into the room in a lavender bathrobe and orthopedic slippers. Her hair stood up like a dandelion puff, and her eyes, normally gentle, were wide with fear. "I thought I was dreaming," she whispered. I heard the window, but then I heard barking. Strong, deep barking, like thunder with a purpose." She knelt beside Shadow and touched his paw. "You saved me, you beautiful thing." Shadow let out a tired huff and leaned into her touch. The story spread quickly. By morning, the Savannah Sentinel had already posted an article titled, "Old Dog, Old Cop, New Heroics." The piece was written by Ellie Greaves, a young journalist with a bob haircut, oversized glasses, and a voice like curiosity personified. Ellie had a reputation for digging beneath headlines, and often wrote human interest pieces that made readers cry over their morning coffee. She called Grace at Pine Haven before lunch. "Hi, I'm doing a piece on Thomas Callahan and Shadow. I heard the dog stopped a robbery last night." Grace blinked at her screen. "He did. Wait, how did you—" "Let's just say Savannah's knitting circles are faster than Twitter." By the next day, Grace received an internal memo from the shelter board. Due to the unprecedented performance and reintegration of Shadow, they were reviewing the trial period with intent to make Thomas's adoption permanent pending medical follow-up. Back on Chestnut Bend, Mrs. Henley walked across the lawn with a paper bag in her arms. She knocked on Thomas's door with a shaky but determined hand. When he opened it, she smiled. Shadow earned this. Inside the bag were 4 homemade peanut butter biscuits and a note that read, "For the best damn neighbor a lady could ask for 4 legs or 2. Shadow gobbled them up without hesitation. The storm rolled in like a memory, slow, loud, and uninvited. Thunder cracked above Savannah, rattling windows and waking dogs from uneasy dreams. The rain lashed at rooftops with a ferocity that felt almost personal. At the Callahan residence, the lights flickered twice before steadying. Inside, Thomas sat in his armchair, his eyes closed, but not asleep. Shadow lay on the rug just a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a creature long familiar with the scent of danger. It was close to midnight when it started. Shadow stirred suddenly, not just the usual twitch of a dream, but a jolt, his whole body going rigid. A strangled yelp escaped him, followed by a violent shudder. His legs twitched, his jaw clenched, eyes wide open but glassy. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, heart thumping, breath stuck in his throat. "Shadow!" he called, crouching beside the dog. "Hey, stay with me." The seizure hit like lightning. Sudden, unforgiving. The old German shepherd's limbs seized, muscles locked, and saliva foamed around his muzzle. Thomas reached for his raincoat with shaking hands, threw the blanket from the couch over Shadow's body for support, and hoisted the dog as best he could. It took everything in him not to collapse under the weight of the animal and of what this moment might mean. Rain soaked him before he'd made it halfway to the car. The roads were nearly empty, visibility low. Headlights cut through the curtain of water as Thomas sped toward Riverside Emergency Animal Clinic, wipers thrashing furiously against the storm. He didn't speak, but his hand stayed firm on Shadow's ribcage, feeling for the faintest motion. He pulled up to the glowing white building, screeched to a stop, and carried Shadow through the automatic doors just as they slid open. The nurse on duty jumped up from her desk, wide-eyed. A moment later, a young woman appeared from the hallway, dressed in deep blue scrubs and a long beige raincoat still dripping. She moved quickly, clipboard in hand. "I'm Emily Carter," she said, taking one look at the dog and snapping into action. "Bring him to exam room 3. Emily was in her mid-20s, with light blonde hair tied in a tight bun and eyes the warm color of chestnuts. Her southern drawl was subtle, but comforting. She moved with the practiced precision of someone who had seen too many late-night emergencies to be rattled by one more. Kind but efficient, she guided Thomas to the room while 2 techs joined her to hook up the IV. Thomas stepped back as Shadow was lifted onto the padded exam table, wires and sensors quickly attached. Emily murmured instructions to the others, her hand never leaving the dog's shoulder. "We've got him stable," she said, finally looking at Thomas. "The seizure has stopped. We'll run labs, monitor his vitals, and keep him under observation." Thomas nodded slowly, then staggered into a chair near the corner of the room, soaked through and shaking slightly not from cold, but from something older. Emily knelt beside him. "You did the right thing bringing him in." "I didn't know if I'd be fast enough," Thomas said. "Didn't know if he'd still be breathing by the time we got here." "He's here," she said softly. "And he's fighting." She offered him a towel and stepped out. Left alone, Thomas pulled out the worn envelope from his coat pocket, folded neatly, yellow paper soft with age. The handwriting was his own, written months ago after Shadow had come back into his life. It was a letter titled, "If This Is Goodbye." He didn't open it, just held it, like an old photograph too painful to unfold. A moment later his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen Grace. He picked up. "Thomas?" Her voice came through, groggy but alert. "I didn't want to wake you." "Too late for that. What's going on?" "It's Shadow," he said, voice cracking despite himself. "Seizure. Bad one. I'm coming." 15 minutes later, Grace arrived at the clinic, still in jeans and an oversized flannel, her hair hastily pulled into a messy ponytail. Rain clung to her shoulders as she stepped into the waiting room and spotted Thomas. Without a word, she sat beside him. "I thought he was dying," Thomas said after a moment. "He went stiff in my arms. No sound. Just gone." Grace didn't speak. She just reached over and placed a hand over his. "She would have known what to do," he said, eyes misty. "Margaret. She always kept her head in storms like this. She would have done exactly what you did," Grace said. "Loved him. Protected him." Silence settled again, thick and damp. Then a knock came from the far side of the hall. Emily appeared at the doorway, eyes soft. "He's conscious." Thomas stood, his knees almost buckling with relief. Grace followed behind as Emily led them back into the exam room. Shadow lay on his side, his chest rising slow but steady. The IV still ran into his paw, but his eyes were open now, blinking sluggishly. When Thomas approached and whispered his name, the old dog's ears twitched. Then, barely a tail wag. Emily smiled and stepped back to give them space. Grace turned away briefly, wiping a tear with her sleeve. "Hey, partner," Thomas said, bending to press his forehead to Shadow's. "You scared the hell out of me." Shadow let out a soft huff, and his tongue grazed Thomas's hand. Emily leaned in. "That's the first time he's reacted to anyone since we stabilized him." The room fell into a reverent hush. For a moment, nothing else existed but a man, a dog, and the thread that bound them, frayed, stretched thin by time and age, but unbroken. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The days that followed the seizure were quiet but heavy, like the pause after thunder. Shadow had pulled through, but the toll was written in the slowness of his steps, the stiffness in his joints, and the way his eyes, though still sharp, lingered longer on faces as if memorizing them. Thomas could feel it too, an awareness in the air, unspoken but understood. Their time together was counting down. The vet had been kind but honest. Shadow's heart was growing weaker. His back legs, already worn from years of service, would fail him sooner rather than later. "He's still here," the doctor had said gently. "But maybe it's time to start saying goodbye in your own way." Thomas didn't cry. He nodded and thanked her, then spent the next night watching over Shadow as the dog slept beside his chair. He thought of their shared years, the missions, the stakeouts, the loneliness, the loyalty. And he made a decision. The next morning, he called Grace. "I want to take him out," he said. "One last time. Just me and him." Grace paused on the other end. "Where?" "Everywhere." She showed up half an hour later with a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a camera hanging around her neck. Her flannel shirt was buttoned all the way up, her sneakers still damp from morning dew. "You're not doing this alone," she said. "He's my boy, too." They started at Fletcher Park, the green heart of Savannah. The trees there bowed over the pathways like old friends, and the benches still bore the initials of teenagers from decades past. Thomas helped Shadow into the passenger seat of his pickup, lifting the dog gently, then drove the slow, familiar route with Grace riding quietly in the back. At the park, they walked slowly, Thomas with one hand on Shadow's harness, Grace trailing behind with her camera. She didn't stage anything. She didn't pose them. She just let the moments unfold. Shadow sniffed at the bushes he once marked as a younger dog, lifted his head at the sound of children laughing in the distance. The wind tousled Thomas's silver hair as he spoke softly to his companion. "You remember this place? You barked at the hot dog vendor here once, made the poor guy drop 2 brats." Grace smiled as she clicked the shutter. "You ever apologize?" "I bought all the hot dogs." Their next stop was the old canine training yard behind the police precinct. The space was rarely used now, overgrown in patches, but the obstacle course still stood a relic of precision and discipline. Shadow's eyes lit up faintly as they approached. He walked slowly between the cones, tail swaying, and stopped near the low wall where he used to leap with ease. He didn't try now, just sat beside it and looked up at Thomas. Thomas patted his head. "That's all right. You already passed the test, partner." From there, they made their way across town to a quiet hilltop cemetery. A place neither of them had visited together, but both knew deeply. The wrought iron gate creaked open under Thomas's hand, and Shadow, as if sensing the gravity of the place, walked with renewed care. They moved between stones weathered by time until they reached the one that mattered most. Margaret Callahan, beloved wife. Faithful friend. The light behind the badge. Thomas stood silently, his hat clutched in one hand. Grace held back near a willow tree, allowing the moment its space. Shadow stepped forward slowly, his nose brushing the base of the headstone. Then he did something that neither of them expected. He raised one paw and placed it gently, deliberately against the stone and leaned forward until his shoulder touched it. Then he turned and sat at Thomas's feet, leaning his weight into the man's leg. Thomas lowered himself with effort, brushing the ground with his knee. He placed a hand on Shadow's back and looked at the grave. "She'd be proud of you," he whispered. "She always was." He swallowed hard, then added in a voice laced with both sadness and peace, "I'm handing off the watch now, Maggie. He's yours again." Grace took the final photo then, the silhouette of a man and his dog, both bowed in stillness before the stone of a woman who had never truly left them. The light slanted through the trees like a blessing, and the wind carried the faint scent of camellias. Later that evening, back at the house, Thomas printed out the best of Grace's photos and slid them into a weathered photo album Margaret had made decades earlier. On the cover, he wrote with a black marker, "One last patrol." The morning sun spilled gently through the window blinds, casting golden bars across the hardwood floor. Savannah's spring had arrived in full bloom, and the scent of jasmine drifted faintly through the air. Birds chirped lazily in the pecan tree, and the wind had a softness to it, the kind of breeze that made you believe just for a moment that everything was exactly where it should be. Thomas Callahan sat in his armchair, a book resting unread on his lap. His gaze drifted toward the rug to the spot where Shadow always slept. And there he was, still as stone, breathing slowed to the faintest rhythm, his head resting on Thomas's foot. It was the stillness that told him. Not the sudden, dramatic silence, but the kind that arrived respectfully, like a soldier reporting for his final duty. Thomas didn't move for a while. He just let the warmth of the dog's head linger against his skin, absorbing what he already knew in his bones. Shadow had passed in his sleep, without sound or struggle, with the dignity of a warrior who knew his watch was done. Later that day, the small backyard was dressed in spring's finest. A patch of earth beneath the pecan tree had been prepared, and a modest wooden cross stood nearby, carved with care. Grace was there, standing quietly in a soft gray dress, a handkerchief balled in her fist. Her husband, Mark, a soft-spoken carpenter with sandy hair and a slow smile, stood beside her holding her hand. Mrs. Henley had come too, in a lavender blouse and her Sunday pearls, holding a plate of peanut butter biscuits she insisted Shadow would have wanted, somehow involved. Elmer Cobb leaned against his cane, his hat removed, and nodded toward the ground with glassy eyes. "I buried 3 of my own out here," Elmer said, "but none like that one." Thomas said nothing for most of it. But when it came time, he stepped forward and placed a small, folded Flag Shadow's canine unit triangle into the earth. "No eulogy," he murmured. He knew what he was. Later, as the guests drifted off and the backyard returned to quiet, Grace sat beside Thomas on the porch steps. "I've been thinking," she said, watching the breeze scatter petals across the grass, "about starting something, for dogs like him." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A fund," she continued, "to support the care of retired canines, especially the ones who don't have a home to return to. Vet bills, food, shelter. I want to call it the Shadow Fund." Thomas stared ahead for a long moment, then nodded. "Make sure his name lives where others can follow it." It didn't take long for the idea to take root. With Grace's relentless drive and Thomas's quiet endorsement, the Shadow Fund launched by early summer. Donations came in first from neighbors, then from law enforcement alumni, then from across the state. The shelter, Pine Haven, agreed to dedicate a special space to retired service dogs, outfitted with heated floors, specialized orthopedic beds, and a therapy garden. In the center of it stood a bronze statue, a German shepherd sitting tall, ears alert, eyes forward. The sculptor, Jesse Morales, was a former Marine turned artist with a square jaw and a sleeve of inked war memorials along his arm. He had interviewed Thomas for hours before designing the piece. At its base, the plaque read, "He never left his post." Thomas stood before the statue on dedication day, one hand resting on his cane, the other in his jacket pocket. Grace stood beside him, giving a short speech about duty, sacrifice, and the invisible work that dogs like Shadow had done for generations. Afterward, a young boy no older than 10 tugged at Thomas's sleeve. He had big brown eyes and a canine patch sewn to his hoodie. "Sir," the boy asked shyly, "is it true your dog saved someone from a robber?" Thomas knelt down slowly, his voice gentle. "He did more than that. He saved people just by showing up, every day." The boy grinned. "I want to be like him when I grow up." Thomas ruffled his hair. "Then you're already halfway there." A few months later, Grace introduced a new arrival to Pine Haven, a 1-year-old German shepherd named Maxwell, named after Shadow's middle call sign, Max. The pup had bright amber eyes, oversized ears, and a curious nose that got him into everything. He was energetic, stubborn, and brilliant. Thomas met him under the shade of the pecan tree. "Too young," he grunted, "too fast, and too mouthy." Maxwell barked and promptly chewed on Thomas's shoelace. But later that week, Thomas agreed to visit 3 times a week for training help. On the first day, Grace handed him the leash and stepped back. Max wiggled with excitement. Thomas leaned in and gave his first command. "Watch!" Max sat still, ears up, eyes locked on Thomas's face. And in that moment, brief and unspoken one legacy passed quietly into another. Shadow's story reminds us that loyalty never ages, love never dies, and miracles often arrive quietly in the form of an old friend returning home, a second chance when you least expect it, or a paw resting gently on your heart when you need it most. In a world that moves too fast, Shadow stood still, faithful, present, and unshaken. His final patrol wasn't about catching criminals or guarding doors. It was about showing us that even when life fades, the bonds we've built, the love we've given, and the duties we've honored remain eternal. And maybe, just maybe, that kind of loyalty is a small reflection of God's love for us, constant, undeserved, and ever watchful. So, if you're going through a quiet season, if you've felt forgotten, or if you're mourning something you've lost, remember this: God sees you, and He sends miracles in fur, in friends, and in moments you may not even recognize as holy. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below where you're watching from and if you believe in second chances. And if you believe that no act of loyalty is ever wasted, write Amen in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us how love, faith, and courage live on, even after the last goodbye. God bless you. May His hand be over you and your home always.